Hello, and welcome back to Lady Jane Books. Today, we are discussing the most shocking book that I think I have read this year, and I'm reading it with one of the OG renowned booktube buddies, very literary Carrie. Carrie, how are you?
I am great. It's so good to see you again. And thank you so much for having me back on your channel.
Well, thank you so much for reading with me. Listen, Carrie and I, like back when I was still like a very active booktuber, we have the best discussions and we have the best time reading with each other.
We do.
And so when I saw this book, I was like, I have to get Carrie like out of retirement for this. Like there's no one else. It has to be very literary Carrie. And so Carrie, you were so kind to read this with me. And that book, that controversial book, was Tender is the Flesh. Oh my gosh. Carrie, listen, I know you had a book club and this was on your list.
Yeah.
Did you think that it was going to be like this when you picked it?
So, no. And I'm going to tell you why. It's one of those books that I've seen, making the rounds on BookTube, but I have purposefully not watched any content about it just because I was so intrigued by the title that I thought it was one of those books where I just wanted to leave the mystery. And I'm really glad that I did. Um, but wow, I Jane,
Yeah.
we read some weird books together. I will say that. And this is probably the weirdest we've read
Yeah.
together.
Yeah. I mean, Carrie and I have read some controversial books. We read like
Yeah.
Lolita. We read the life book, what was it?
A
A
Little
Little
Life.
Life. And now but I think this topped all of them. I think this one is
Yeah.
probably the most controversial book that like we've read. And so it had to be like with Carrie. There was no one else that I could discuss this with except very literary Carrie. So to dive in, I had actually heard about this book in like the horror book community, and I kind of knew what it is about. Like people kept it very general about the subject matter. And when I heard about that, I was like, okay, that's weird. By the way, if you're watching this, this is going to be like all the spoilers because it's a short book and we really can't get into it non-spoilery, because a lot of the most shocking factors are spoilers. So just know that we're going to talk about all the gory details. And see what I did
We're
there,
really
Carrie?
gonna flesh it out.
Very good, very good. So let's start cooking with it. And and so I had heard about this book before, and the premise just kind of intrigued me because I had heard that it was about people who ate each other and like humans were now this new commodity of meat. But I and so like on a surface level, I was like, okay, that's weird, that's creepy. But I had no idea about how deep, disturbing, and gritty this book was. And I don't think I was prepared, Carrie. I think I'm a little changed because of this book, to be honest.
Wow.
Yeah. I think it's one of those. So
Yeah.
so to start off, let's just say hi to a couple people because we got an audience today. We have Hypersanity Books. Hello, hello. How are you? It's always nice to see you. Jason Cross Reads Books says hi to me and to you, Carrie.
Hi,
Ross Games.
Jason.
Ross Games is here, as is PR Far and Soothing Sounds. So we got quite the crew today. So, Carrie, to start off this book, it kind of talks about there's a little bit of a political climate that's going on in the background. So, the first idea is that there was this virus that wiped out all of the animals, or like it was dangerous to humans, so humans had to choose to get rid of all of the animals in their society, the livestock, the pets, and all of that. But there's definite undertones to that because then we see that this new market really emerged and So what did you think about that? Like, what did you think about kind of this background, like political toying?
It did make me very suspicious of the government right from Jump Street.
Mm,
Just because I'm not a crazy conspiracy theorist or anything, but I just knew that in order for the government to execute, I'm trying to be very careful with how I'm wording this.
mhm,
Um I don't want to give up too much right off the bat, but in
mhm.
order for the government to execute their plan, they have to have complete control over the people.
Yeah.
And anytime you have a government trying to exercise complete control over the population, you question um, that government's motivations. I mean, I can't think of many times throughout history where all freedoms are suspended. I mean, sure, like in times of warfare, there's been times, where okay, habeas corpus was suspended once in the Civil War. Very extreme circumstance, very short period of time relatively. This book, it's a whole different level, so it did make me very, very suspicious that there was more to this than just the government, reacting to this virus that supposedly has killed all of the animals. Were you suspicious of the government or no?
I was, to be honest, because it just seemed I don't know if I jumped on the bandwagon here of they made up a virus to like create this new thing. I think maybe the new market was almost a byproduct of it. Like I think they had I think they probably did, like, manufacture or kind of fearmonger a bit about, the risk of the animals, and I
Yeah,
think 'cause we've seen this in history too. We've seen this, like, people take one thing and they run with it and it becomes something totally different, like the Salem witch trials, like, Satanic Panic, which I just talked about with, Greener Side of Sam. So and those really got out of hand.
yeah,
So, we definitely see, like, kind of maybe like an opportunity in order to take control and maybe something that started out rather innocuously. I mean, I don't know how much, it can be innocuous, but then it grew and grew and grew and evolved to something totally devastating. And we've seen that in history before. So, and I think then these markets emerged in response to that. And then the government was like, that's not a bad idea. Okay. So I don't think anything was set out to start something like this, but I do think there was opportunity and maybe lobbying. And because we unfortunately did see that also with the pandemic sometimes, that
yeah,
these new markets emerged and people took advantage, is what I'm saying.
yeah.
So I think it was a situation like that. Whether or not there actually was a virus is immaterial. Um, but I do think there was a part of mass hysteria that went into it.
Well, I think you bring up a great example because you just mentioned, the Salem witch trials. And there are some historians who look at that and they talk about the economic motivations behind
Mm,
the Salem witch trials, and that yes, maybe people did like seize upon this hysteria, but there were underlying reasons for people in power to want to go after specific people, and a lot of them were women who had property and
yeah,
you
there's
know
always an underlying cause somewhere. There's always
yeah.
a financial gain somewhere.
So, that
Excuse me.
that's definitely something that kind of, made me think. about this whole scenario. And also, there are so many people who are vegan. Like I just the concept was a little bit hard to believe. It was, which I know, I understand it's fiction, but I there was a lot of effort put into this book to create like vocabulary and kind of a narrative around how this system works. And I wish a little bit more attention had been paid to the why. Like, why are we having to why is cannibalism now a thing? Um,
Yeah.
it was like, okay, well, you can't get all of your, essential amino acids. Okay, but if you pair things together like rice and beans or whatever, like you can. So I don't you can totally survive and be perfectly healthy. Um, I'm not vegan. I love my protein. But given the choice of becoming a vegan or becoming a cannibal,
Yeah, no,
you know,
I don't think there's any, competition there, Carrie.
there's no competition. So I just that was one little kind of issue I had with the book, because I couldn't understand. We always have people who, are in poverty and don't have enough to eat. And so, like in the book, there are these scavengers, right? These people who are competing for the scraps,
Mhm.
essentially, the scraps of flesh and, or the less desirable meat, less savory tasting people. Um, and so like I understand that there would be elements of people who would be, starved and like really um eager to do whatever they needed to do to survive.
Mhm.
But the whole what did you think about the hierarchy that developed and kind of like this becoming like a status symbol?
Okay, I'm so glad you brought that up because something I think this book kind of alludes to, but I didn't get till it concluded, was that we are seeing him. Marcos is the protagonist, and we are almost led to believe that Marcus is like an average guy. He's just kind of like goes home and he goes to work and type of things. But then I started thinking, and I'm like, wait, Marcos is like almost the VP of a processing of the major food corporation in this society. And I'm like, Marcus isn't average.
Yeah.
Marcus is one of the minority elite. But the thing is, because we're in his perception, we don't get that. We think that he's just like in this and he has no choice and he's resigned and he's an average Joe type of guy. But then when I'm thinking about it, I'm like, wait a minute. So he's meeting with all of these like other executives. They're all making money because they're have this like oligopoly or oligop yeah. You know what I mean? Almost a monopoly on this trade, right? And he looks at the stain with the scavengers, and the scavengers are all like, they're very spoken about in a negative way. But I was thinking to myself, what if they're actually just the average populace? You know what I mean? Because there seems to be this idea that, you know, like he looks down on them, like, they take this and they're starving and everything. But I'm thinking about there's no intermediaries here. We don't hear about like someone just going into the market and purchasing it like an average Joe. So I'm thinking to myself, what in this dystopian exactly is going on here? So I'm thinking he's actually the minority elite and there's a classism here and the
Yeah.
scavengers are actually the majority populace,
Ooh.
which I'm
That
that yeah.
That changes things. That makes it so much more dark. I don't know that it could get much darker, but um that, and you are pretty perceptive there, because now that I'm thinking about it, when we do hear about people going into the different butcher shops, a lot of the time it was like maids.
Rich people.
And yeah, so that makes sense. Something else too about uh him being kind of elitist. He displayed a really intense disdain for the one gentleman who came to apply for a job at the processing plant. And there were two candidates, and
Mhm.
one candidate, they thought he might get sick, from viewing some of the things, but
Yeah,
he
he
kind of
couldn't
made it
stomach it,
through.
yeah.
But the other guy seemed to take delight
Yeah, a
in
little sadistic.
this horrific process.
Yeah.
And so I just thought it was almost laughable that here is, Marcos, he's a vital part of this whole process. He is making it happen. He is participating fully in this whole thing. And it's just too much for his sensibilities that someone would take delight in this. So, that to me, it kind of speaks to the fact that he doesn't show it, but deep down, like, you recognize that this is something so abhorrent that
Yeah.
you shouldn't take delight in it.
No.
Um, Now, I'm not saying that means our main character has any sort of regret, but I think maybe subconsciously, his disdain for that man like shows like, hey, this is what can happen to people, I guess, who live in this sort of society. This is how people fall victim to the narrative, right? Because he's part of the process. He has the job. It's a really good job apparently. He makes good money. Um he is very influential. And so, you kind of get to see how people are um wooed by that and are um convinced, I suppose, with the language that is used, that this is necessary and um, that this is okay. And I think that was one of the points that you were going to talk about as far as the use of language.
Right, exactly. So, one of the things that he actually talks about early on is this idea of sanitized language. And it's kind of like euphemisms and terminologies that kind of lessen the blow. Sorry, pun, that was an unintended pun if you've read this book.
That
Um,
was really good.
lessen the blow of the horror of actually what's going on. And so when I started thinking about it, I'm like, oh my gosh, they're right. Like, they don't talk about people as livestock, they talk about them as heads. They definitely don't talk about them as people, not even humans. And there's a lot of like sanitized like processes and language that they try to make it a little more palatable. I know this is gonna be full of puns, Carrie, I'm so sorry. It's
All
gonna
of it.
be more palatable than what's actually going on, which is killing people. And so one thing that and I do see that being started in by the government with like you can see how like the use of laws are and the language of laws and what people can and cannot do. And that actually leads me to one of my points is that continuing on with this idea of the role of government, just because something's legal doesn't make it okay. What do you
Yeah.
think, Carrie?
I mean, absolutely. I think, just look at Supreme Court precedents. I mean, things change over time. And hopefully, I mean, I think the hope of everyone in society is that we progress and we get better and we learn from mistakes and we make things, um, more equitable, more fair. And, um, that's always the hope. Because yeah, there have been um most examples that are coming to mind right now for me of like injustice were things that were perfectly legal at the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
Segregation, perfectly legal. That was legal. That was upheld at the time, 1896 Supreme Court Plessy decision. That was upheld until it was overturned. So, I think anytime you have a situation where the government is endorsing a policy that is um, so clearly wrong, uh, you have to have people who are willing to organize and to stand up against whatever that policy is, and to change that policy. Um, in this particular book, I thought our main character at certain points
Yeah.
was that person. I had very high hopes that he was going to not necessarily like change the entire system, but change the part that he played, because there are people, I mean, there's a certain time in the book where he does not eat meat. So, I mean, it's possible to just not eat the meat. And that is a way that you can, um, maintain your personal ethics and um, still survive. I don't think people were being murdered or thrown in prison or anything in this dystopia because they weren't eating meat.
No.
Um, so yeah, he could have done that. He could have also saved someone.
Mhm.
Um,
Mm.
and he doesn't.
Yeah. Yeah. I think also what's really interesting is that it's kind of an extreme example, like the whole idea of like cannibalism. It's so extreme, but it's
Yeah.
so interesting to me that something that is so inherently abhorrent in society, as long as somebody signs some papers, then we all change our morals for it. And that's actually kind of what scared me the most about this because, you know, there's a lot of things here that are taboo in a way, and they're taboo because they're meant to keep society like from going down certain paths. But to go from, eating people is wrong to, well, it's okay and we're going to institutionalize it and this is actually going to be your only option. It's such a pendulum swing.
Yeah.
And it's just really crazy to me that everyone went with it. That they're really and we find out that there really isn't anybody that's standing up to this.
Yeah.
And it's kind of crazy to me about how fluid this taboo is. And if we can be fluid about this taboo, what else can we be fluid about? Like how far does it go? And so it really scared me how generally accepted this became so quick just because some people in power said it was okay.
Yeah.
It's crazy to me, to be honest. It's quite insane. So I think that's probably one of the most frightening things of the story. But PR Far chimed in that nobody capitalizes on a core crisis quite like the government. True
They
that, PR
do.
Far.
They do.
Hypersanity is enjoying the discussion. Jason Cross says that's a dark thought about the society. It's yeah, but unfortunately, I think it's true, Jason.
Well,
And it's oh sorry.
Anne. Oh, I haven't seen Anne.
I know. She said she would definitely go vegan in that world. Yeah, me too, man.
Yes, yes, for
Sorry,
sure,
sorry,
for
Carrie.
sure. No, I was just
But
gonna say, I think, you know, that's the point of the book. I think is to by using this extreme example and something that's so taboo and showing all of these people like getting on board with it seemingly. Um that really I think makes you question, well, what would I go along with and
yeah,
how could this happen? I mean,
yeah.
how could this happen? I think that's what we always ask ourselves after any sort of atrocity, you know,
Mm.
Nazi Germany. How could this happen, right? And then
Which
of
I saw a
course,
lot of
and
parallels. Yeah, with that in this book
yeah,
too. I saw a lot of parallels, which kind of shocked me as well.
Yeah.
Sorry, Carrie, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, 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 no. Me too, for sure. Yeah.
So, and I think he actually like refers like to people like with those names and things like that we know very famously from stories coming out of that too, which I think
Yes.
was really
Yes.
interesting as well. So I saw a little nod there from the author. Um, and it is kind of like war crimes almost. Like is every like again like what the scavengers are doing, like they see as like a war crime, but to the scavengers it may just be necessity. And like where's the line of your morality and values at weird times like that? So I thought that was really interesting that it was explored in this story.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Well, it's hard to have. I think it's also, you kind of, I don't want to say sympathize, but you are a little more understanding, I think, of the scavengers than we are of the main character, because I think
yeah.
when you are truly in a desperate situation and you literally are starving, um then I think everyone understands that morals are and social mores are a little more fluid
Yeah. Yeah.
in those situations. I mean, we've seen, like, you know, small small instances even in modern, times. I say modern times, like the Donner Party,
Yeah.
where people have had to
Yeah.
forego their sensibilities to try to survive a very desperate situation. Which, ironically enough, those folks did not. They weren't dying of malnutrition. They were dying of the elements, but it kind of hysteria, plays into them
Yeah.
thinking they're going to starve, and so that kind of feeds
Those
into it.
extreme
And
conditions also make,
yeah,
people like bend with their morality and their thinking too.
for sure, for sure.
Absolutely. Um, so the character Marcos, kind as we said, he's kind of like this um, guy that runs this plant, and as a gift, he gets I don't remember what you call it, but it was like one of these weird genetically unmodified women. So
First generation product,
yeah, or something like that.
FGP.
Yeah. Um, and so when obviously we spend a lot of time looking at their relationship, what did you think was going to happen to her? Like, what did you think of, first of all, their like relationship? And then what do you think was going to be the end result with her?
I thought there was going to be a semi happy ending.
Yeah. No.
Um, I think the intense amount of attention that he was giving her,
Excuse
um,
me.
and seemingly tender feelings and tender moments that he had for this person. And I truly thought that he had started to see her as a person and not a
I
product.
did too.
Um, I thought that would carry the day. Now, I didn't know, I thought maybe the government or something would step in and, like, something bad would happen. But
Yeah,
I
take her
didn't
away
think,
or take him away or yeah,
yeah, I didn't think it would come like it did.
me neither. I thought that I thought that this whole book was about him preserving his humanity because one of the things that really scared me about this book was there was a complexity. And it didn't take long for people who in this society to separate themselves from other people. And I thought that some of the language he used in some of the instances meant that he was still holding on to like his old ways of thinking, before all this was happening, and presuming his humanity through her. And it shocked me at the end that that was not the case. So that's what I thought. And the reason I say that is because I want to actually talk about the difference between heads and people, which I think is really interesting. So in this story, heads are these genetically modified people who are bred in captivity, and they're treated basically as livestock, as we in our society treat like livestock and the farming industry, they're doing with genetically modified people. But Carrie, what did you think about kind of the whole system and what they considered product versus not product? I'm kind of interested to hear your thoughts on that.
So, it's interesting because, of course, they're calling the product head, just like head of cattle.
Yeah,
I have 50 head of cattle, and here we have head. So they're using the language. They're definitely dehumanizing them. They don't wear clothing. They cut their vocal cords so they don't have to deal with, at least, any auditory emotions. Um, so they've done all of that. However, they still, even with all of that, and trying to sanitize it and make it um as clean and neat as possible, they still have people with names who they are
right,
killing and they
right.
are using for meat. And some of those people are doing it voluntarily, which was its own
That
little crazy side story.
yeah, that messed me up a bit. I was like, "Whoa." Like, um, what I find really interesting is that we are led to think that they are very separate, that they're not people in this society, right? But then I got to thinking, like, wait a minute, they're bred in captivity. Okay, so they're still being born somehow. Their vocal cords are cut. They are not socialized, so they don't have regular development. But I was like, every single thing that makes them product is artificially done. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's not that they're born with a different genetic or anything like that. They did talk about how they pumped them full of medicine and they like did all these weird like gene experiments, which again is also another kickback to Nazi Germany that we were discussing. But I'm thinking, and I was like, the only difference is things that are being done to them, not necessarily that they are different. And so that's another thing that really messed me up because I was like, there's no difference between, a person who's deemed as a head and Marcos. There's no difference aside from just how they're being treated. And so that
Eh,
really scared me because then it questions like their consciousness, how much they understand of what's going on, their emotional intelligence. And I think that also scared the crap out of me with this book.
Well, and I think that's the point. I think it's meant to, because that's how discrimination works, right? That's
Yeah.
exactly how discrimination works. And, we have many different types of people, who are of different physical abilities, different mental abilities, different mental capacities. And that doesn't mean that they have fewer rights, right? We've established, I think, you know, most, modern democracies at least have established that there are certain basic human rights that we all have because we're human, because, you know we all have the um same life. I mean, it might look different, but we're all the same,
Right.
um in that regard. So yeah, that is scary because, just, there are plenty of people who can't speak. And
Mhm.
that doesn't make them less human. But here we
Right.
have, in this scenario, their attempts to make people less human are,
Like
uh,
systematic.
yeah,
Yeah.
systematic and pretty superficial. I mean, because
Extremely superficial.
I feel like, given just a little bit of time and attention, the character Jasmine, she assimilated pretty well,
Yeah. She took on
considering.
like human qualities, and I mean human as it's
Yeah,
using in the book, not. She obviously
yeah,
was human, but in the book she was considered a head, but she kinda took on those more naturalistic human qualities that are described in the
yeah.
book. But I think what really messes with me too is that because those changes are so artificial and they're so man-made, there isn't really a line between treating people as heads and the people who are on the other side of the society. And it messed me up that they really can't see that. I mean, there is kind of this illusion to, like, well, when I die, I'm going to be eaten by relatives or stuff like that. And so they talk about it in a really jokey way. But I'm thinking, I was like, there really is no line here. You know what I mean? Like, they're all
There
treated
isn't.
about like that. And yeah. And I'm like,
Once you cross that line, once you start seeing humans as less than human, any group, any, race, ethnicity, gender, whatever it is, once you start seeing a different group as less than human, everyone should be scared. And I
yeah,
think history has
exactly.
proven that again and again. And I think the reason you feel so unsettled with this book is because you know that, right? You
Yeah.
recognize that. You're like, "Oh gosh, like everybody in this world, whether they realize it or not, whether they want to admit it or not, they're in a really precarious position."
Yeah, yeah. Because I was thinking to myself, I was like, they talk about this like in like, oh, when I die, like my family will like eat me, or I'm gonna sign the paper so I can't be eaten. But I'm just thinking, I was like, this could literally happen to you, and you're endorsing it, and it will be totally different scenario when it is you. Because there's again this elitist idea that he's the one in charge, and he's the one determining like what happens to the heads and who gets sold where and all this stuff. But I'm just like, buddy, that could be you because the line is so artificial. And like
Yep.
and yeah, the laws change to like allow the cannibalism. But what happens when the laws change again and just because you have a name doesn't protect you anymore? Because
Right.
that's where we're going. Okay. What if the
Yeah.
scavengers are actually not like illegal activity anymore? Like, what is that the next step? And just kind of like that oblivion to his situation and to the situation in the society as a whole was one of the more like interesting aspects for me because I'm like, well, where
Yeah.
does the line go? It's we're
Yeah.
here now, but where are we going?
Yeah. Well, and I think there's a little bit of recognition on his part that, I don't know that he recognizes fully the danger that he could be in. But I think when that inspector comes to his house,
And then he's
he
like, "I could go to the
starts,
slaughterhouse." But
yeah,
at the same time, he feels invincible because he knows somebody in charge.
yeah,
So even though he knows, he's a little like, "Well, like I know," which is another thing that tipped me off that he's elite because he gets
yeah.
the special privileges, he gets these gifts, he knows the people in charge, the rules don't apply to him. So which was another thing that told me like he's not an average Joe in this.
But it does um show that eventually, he could be out of favor because his one
Oh
friend
yeah.
has now, I think, retired or something, and so that
Oh,
new
he's been like
inspector was like,
promoted.
"Yeah,
Yeah, he was
yeah,
promoted, but then soon he'll retire.
yeah." So I think, that could change, and uh, yeah, I don't know how I feel about the end of this book. It really, that the end. I mean, the book was disturbing, but cannibalism. Hey, I've seen Soylent Green. If you've never seen Soylent Green, you should watch it, Jane.
I
Um,
haven't.
movie from the, I think it's the 80s, maybe early 80s, late 70s, but Charlton Heston in it. And this book definitely gave me Soylent Green vibes. So I mean, I've seen cannibalism before in media, but I think the real disturbing part for me is the idea, and I'm going to go into a spoiler here.
Mhm,
So if you don't want to know about a spoiler at the end, guys, please dip out for a minute.
mhm. Nice having
Um,
you. Get it? Having you?
uh, oh my
Sorry.
gosh,
Sorry. I can't stop. Sorry.
you can't. This is why I love you, Jane. But he's having a kid with Jasmine, this head, right? So he's
Mhm,
having a child. and he and his wife intend to raise this child. They're, getting rid of the product, right? And they've used her for what they need, and they're moving on. But my whole thought process behind that is, at what point does that child, suffer the consequences of this? When that child does something that displeases these parents, are they going to say, "Oh, well,
You're half
he's
head, yeah,
half head, so let's cook him up for Thanksgiving dinner."
yeah,
I don't know what that looks like, because it's hard for me to imagine people having the capacity to love and care for a child after doing something so horrific. And I think that also speaks to, like, historical circumstances. Like, for example, when people see images and video of Hitler with his dogs, and he was a big animal lover, and he's being so friendly and seems to really love his dogs, right?
yeah,
That's
yeah,
really so awkward for us, right? Because
yeah,
it's really hard. It's hard to reconcile that someone could do something so, quote, normal or mundane, or similar to, like, maybe how we would act with our kid or our dog or whatever, and then they could turn around and do something so horrific.
yeah,
And to me, that was the thing that was so disturbing about this, was just
yeah,
imagining this person now taking care of a child.
yeah. And I think also that's also reflected in Claudia, the mother, because Claudia's been absent through all this. She's grieving her own loss. You know, she's really separate from Marcos in this. And as soon as he brings her in, which I think was extremely risky, like I
Yeah.
was surprised, to be honest. I thought maybe the other butcher maybe would come in that he was having an affair with, but I'm
Hmm.
just like, okay, we're bringing Claudia into this. And the first thing like Claudia says is like, you could go to the slaughterhouse. What are you doing? And then she gets what she wants, which is a child, and she's perfectly okay with it because it
Yeah.
benefits her. And
Yeah.
that's the giant theme of what this book is about. How you can accept something that's so unacceptable when it benefits you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I thought that was really, really interesting. um, the really interesting part of this book too is that through well, first let me go through some comments, but Hypersanity says what is said about the system is not opposed, but how laws can change, getting on board with it. Yeah, yeah, exactly. It doesn't take much, evidently. So, oh, Katrina, how are you? Hi. This one rocked my world when I read it a couple years ago. It rocked my world now. Like I think I was a quarter of the way through, and I was like, I don't know what I'm reading. This is something else. And Jason Cross reads books says it seems like the society is one step from turning criminals into food as punishment method. I think they do that. They do that because anyone who breaks the law goes to a special slaughterhouse. But then I'm also like, are you going to run out of people here? Like, you know. So I don't know. Which is another really
Well,
interesting. Like we can treat everyone else like that, but it could happen to me. So
is this the answer to overpopulation? Is this what, um because that is one thing too in the book that it still makes you question, because I don't think we ever get a definitive answer as to whether the government actually, like, orchestrated this, viral attack on the animals in order to resort to the cannibalism to deal with overpopulation. That was something that I think was posited by, like, a group of kids or something,
yeah,
which I thought was kind of funny, because I was like, oh my gosh, I was kind of thinking the same thing. And these little kids, like, had the same idea
they got it. Yeah, yeah.
that I did. But then, too, when you're worried about overpopulation, it didn't they didn't solve the problem, right? Because they still had scavengers, right? They still had that. And then they're also producing more people for right the genetically
Yeah.
engineered, head. I don't know. It just seemed like they didn't really solve anything with this other than like an immediate problem, I suppose. Um, and I don't know. It just, I think too, maybe one of the disturbing parts and makes it kind of hard to understand is we don't really hear about the process like of okay, so what happened to the animals, we hear about that, and then all of a sudden cannibalism, like there's no slow
Yeah, it's just
progression.
all of a sudden cannibalism.
It's just
I'm
like
gonna print
okay
that
the
on a
animal.
t-shirt, Carrie, and all of a sudden cannibalism.
I mean, and all of a sudden cannibalism, it just, I think that's it's hard to wrap your head around that, and people
Yeah.
being okay with it, because I think most of the time in history things are a little more, slow. Maybe, you ease in, there's a few laws maybe that are discriminatory against a group, and then kind of it escalates, and then things turn violent, and then, you end up with a really horrific situation. Um, so I think like historically we kind of see like things amping up. But we didn't see that in this book. It was just kind of like,
No.
hey, first solution on deck, cannibalism. Like
Exactly, right?
I
Yeah, it's and suddenly cannibalism.
and suddenly
Anyway,
cannibalism. That would be a great
I'm gonna
shirt.
make like a little like Lady Jane like merch shop, and then that's gonna be like number one. And suddenly cannibalism. It's very on brand.
Love it. Love it.
um, I think what's also interesting is that, and we've touched upon this a little bit earlier, but through the language and through the perception of Marcos, we excuse me, through with the perception of Marcos and his disdain for like his colleagues, he doesn't have very good descriptions of even people in his own echelon, like the guy with the long fingernails and the tanner guy that he doesn't like, the one who does like the skins, I think.
Oh yeah.
Um, he has very like negative views of like everybody around him. And what I think is really brilliant about this book is that we presume that that's because he hates the industry and he hates what society has become. But again, spoiler alert, it's not that he hates the industry, it's his own grief, which I think
Yeah.
is really interesting. And that, we it hints to it and it outright tells us that like he's lost a child and his marriage is in things. So we think it's just like about he's holding on to his humanity, but really he's just going through something that's deeply personal. And again, obviously what's happened to him is horrible, losing a child. But in the story, we realize that it's incredibly selfish. It's not this,
Yeah.
you know, um, altruistic idea. It's not that he has contempt for what he's doing, but it's that he's actually battling a depression because of something that's happened to him. So
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that I thought that was really kind of brilliant because it changes our entire perspective of him.
Yeah. For sure. Um he and again, I think it's hard to reconcile someone having such grief over a life, and then on the flip side treating people
Yeah.
like cattle.
Yeah.
um it's very hard, but I think, throughout history, again, we have examples of that. A lot of serial killers and mass murderers still had families and wives or friends or people that they cared about. So it's very interesting to me. I think you and I have talked a ton over the last few years about the brain and how that works, and how the minds of serial killers work and things like that. And I think there is something different about some people that allows them to compartmentalize things. And reconcile things within themselves and justify things to themselves. And unfortunately, in this book, it seems like there are quite a few of those people.
Yeah, it's crazy. I'll go out there and use that word. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Um, speaking of um, kind of this idea. Oh, sorry, hang on. In Australia, there are groups meeting in restaurants and making scenes, shouting. Yeah, people can get very, very
Yeah.
extreme. Yeah,
Yeah.
obviously, and that's probably what this book is about too. It's very extreme.
Well, and I think
And
that's a
then,
great point because like you and I, we've talked about some weird things throughout history. And uh we have at great length tried to understand, right?
mhm.
Or at least discuss like why these things happen or
Yeah,
what's
the
going
root
on. And
causes
I
and
think we never will. And I think that's the point because we don't have the mind, thankfully, of a serial killer or a mass
right.
murderer or a
Thank goodness. Yeah,
yeah, or a cannibal. We
and
just
suddenly
don't
cannibalism.
have we just don't have that mindset. So I think it is, we're trying to reconcile things and we'll never be able to because our brain just does not work like that. Thank
Yeah,
God.
I know. Definitely, definitely. That's a good point. Yeah. And I think what's also really impressive about this book is that it does take real world examples or very similar situations and then puts it in a way that we're like, that's insane. Like, what would you? But then we think about it and we're like, wait, things like that actually did happen in a different way. And so
Yeah.
I think that's part of the brilliance of this book too.
Yeah.
And Anne says she would buy the merch and suddenly cannibalism. All right, you know what, Anne? You're going to be the first order. Here we go.
I love it.
So, there's we did talk a little bit about kind of the ambiguity about taboo in this community. So obviously, something that was taboo as soon as the government sanctioned it wasn't taboo anymore. And I thought it was kind of interesting because there's a lot of like contradictions in this book. So like for example, um the hamburger scene where somebody on staff just became a father and then they used a very young person as hamburger meat. And something like that was just really odd to me. Again, talking about how we can't really conceptualize some of these things, even though we kind of try. And it's like, wait a minute, you're celebrating bringing in new life and your addition to the family, and yet you're using something that's very similar and having no feelings towards it. So I
Yeah.
thought that was kind of interesting, and this book is full of contradictions like that, full of it, where you have to
Yeah.
kind of stop and think and be like, "Wait a minute, what?" So, yeah. Do you remember that scene?
Well, and I do remember that scene. And another scene that I think kind of goes along with that is the rock star. I don't know if you remember that. The rock
Yeah,
star who he goes on this hunting preserve, and basically if they um put themselves out there as prey for people to hunt humans for sport. If they survive, their debts are cleared, so it's a way to get out of debt. And unfortunately, he does not survive. He is killed
with
in the
5
last few
hours to spare.
hours. That he's Yeah.
Yeah,
And, these people are sitting around and they're laughing about, this gentleman who had a name and who was very well known, and people seem to love him and love his music. And they're talking about what he's going to taste like and who gets what part of him. And I think that really puts on display that this whole thing is about power because those people, it was like a status thing to say I killed this person and ate them. Like it's the weirdest status symbol I've ever come across in a book, but that was a level of status, just like our main character's sister when she finally had a head in her house that she was cutting up piece by piece and serving. That afforded her some status, right? Because not everyone has their own head, right? And most people would just have to buy the meat, whatever pieces they could get at the butcher or whatever. But having that, possessing that, um, gave her gave her status, and that was just bizarre, so
I
bizarre.
kinda I kinda linked it to, like, in modern social media, if a celebrity liked your post, then you have the status, even though it's actually quite
Yeah,
meaningless, you know what I mean?
yeah,
And even though, like,
yeah,
they may not even be the celebrity, it's probably, like, an assistant or something, but we attribute such an artificial value to that, you know what I mean? So,
yeah.
but really it's quite meaningless. So that's kinda what I saw, like, with the hunting thing, like, it's actually meaningless, you know what I mean? But to them, it had such value. I
Well, and
actually
I
wanna
don't
talk.
know,
Go
do
ahead.
you know if this author is vegetarian or vegan?
I don't know off the top, but I'm very curious. I
That
have heard that
would
some
be,
of their other work focuses on, like, the same thing, kinda like food industry and maybe, like, like the meat industry industry, so I am interested to find out. But it would make sense
yeah, yeah,
because there's a
for
lot
sure.
of parallels to the modern like, how the process is done and, like, there's a lot of parallels to the current meat industry too, which is very controversial as well.
Yeah, sure.
I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about the role of the sister in this. Um, he holds a lot of contempt for his sister and their her children. Um, what did you think about that? Because I was just kind of surprised about his attitudes, but then he turns around and he like does the same thing, kind of. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it was kind of weird because he seemed annoyed that and disgusted by the fact that she wanted a head.
Exactly.
And I'm like,
Well, you
why?
keeping one? Like, yeah, you're
You're
like
you got one.
you literally have one, and you're giving her a name. Like, if anyone's
Yeah.
in the wrong here, in this society.
eh, He I think a lot of the contempt had to do with the dad. He was
Yeah.
essentially, I guess, the primary caregiver for the dad. Um, and he, seemed to genuinely love his dad and like remembered things about his dad. And there's a scene in the book where he spreads his dad's ashes. Like he seemed to do it at a place that was special to them. So
Yeah.
he does all of these things. And so I think he really cared about his dad. And I think the contempt he showed for her was the fact that she didn't care about the dad. Which I find really crazy because to me, if you're gonna live in this society, the way she was acting was completely normal, right? She
Yeah.
was just, I say normal. I say
Yeah.
normal for that
Within this book. Yeah, yeah.
dystopian hellhole, okay? But she was acting completely within the confines of how people would act, and yet he seemed to have such contempt, like you say, for her, because she wasn't caring enough for their father. And it's like, okay, wait a minute, dude, like you are literally part of a process that is torturing and killing people for food. Like,
Yeah. What
really?
leg do you have to stand on? Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. Well, I think what's also interesting, I saw kind of this is before the end reveal, but I think it actually fits. I saw the father as a metaphor for his declining um humanity a little bit. So like, we kind of hear the stories about like when the father was alive and like how full of life and like importance and his father didn't like the trade. So that was like kind of him at the very beginning before all this bad stuff was happening. And then
Yeah.
of course the father's like losing his mind, he's losing his mind, he's like not really him. So he's kind of getting lost in all of this. And then when the father passes away, the scene is then followed with him slaughtering Jasmine. And so I kinda saw that it was kinda letting go of his own humanity and kind of that declining process, just as the father was declining mentally as well.
That's actually a really good point. So maybe like the father is, the last vestige of the old world, the
Yeah.
world before the virus, the world before, everything just became crazy.
Yeah, and I
Um,
think I think part of the contempt was that he in that moment was mourning that a little bit. Again, we could be all off base because obviously a big curveball is thrown at the end of this book. But
Yeah.
I think part of the contempt for him was that he's just lost his humanity and the sister's going on as normal. And that's kind of where he was like, you don't understand anything, do you? So
Yeah.
I think that's kind of where it went that, y- yeah. Yeah, it's a complicated situation.
Yeah.
So, did you see what was yeah, I think I may have already asked this, but now that we've kind of circled the block with this question, um, do you did you see uh, did you think what happened to Jasmine would happen to Jasmine? Like, what was your, like, of all the possibilities in the story, what did you really think about the ending? Do you think he changed through it, or do you think, like, he was always kind of this soulless monster in this weird capitalist cannibalism society?
I think he was always this way because everything at the end was wrapped up so kind of handily. Like
Yeah.
it was almost as if, I know it wasn't because she kind of goes into birth unexpectedly, but it was almost as if he planned it. I feel
Yeah.
like it just and I don't know if that's because, it's not a super long book, so you do kind of have to wrap things up quickly. So I don't know if maybe it was a pacing thing for me and I just, because it was, done quickly in the book, that gave me the impression that this was like something that he had thought about and already pre-planned and kind of thought this was the game plan, that he was going
Yeah.
to provide this new child for his wife. And
Yeah.
yeah, the fact that she was so on board with it as
So
well
quick. So quick
kind of
too.
kind of led me to believe that, like, maybe, we don't know like what he has said to her. Maybe he had promised her that he would fix this, when their son passed away. I'm going to
Yeah.
fix this, figure something out. I'm a very powerful, influential person. I can figure something out. Um, who knows? Who knows?
Something I thought was really interesting looking back is that when he and Jasmine are first together, and they are together in the barn, um, the author uses really language and he's like, and I did what I wanted to do, even though it was like against the law. We in that moment think he's looking for connection through intimacy. So we think that it's like, okay, he's mourning the loss of his kid. He's, mourning the loss of his wife's not there. And he's in this thing. So we think that he's having kind of a romantic moment and this kind of like nostalgia for a simpler time, where everything was easy between a man and a woman. Um, but now looking back, I'm like, oh, he was hoping for a baby through this. It wasn't
Yeah,
actually about connection with Jasmine. It's like, I'm doing what I want to do. He wanted to have a baby with her.
yeah,
So, yeah, that kind of changed the way I looked at that and looked at how he was treating her, like domesticating her, and then like the whole like I thought the thing about the stunning was really, really interesting because he outright tells us like every, person who's in this like has their own way of stunning a head, you know what I mean? So it lessens the blow quite literally. And so he literally tells us, but it goes above our heads, which in a way, then the author is stunning us for the blow in a
yeah.
literary sense. And I'm just like, oh my
Touche.
God. I'm just like, oh my God, this is actually brilliant.
Yeah,
So, yeah, so I thought that was really interesting and so yeah. And then we realized he didn't have his humanity at all. One last thing, he spends a lot of time thinking about these puppies in the zoo, in this desolated zoo.
yeah.
What role do you think the scenes with the puppies played?
Ooh, They have to be symbolic of something, right? They have to be. They have to be. I wish I had spent some time thinking about this before this show, so I would have something really impressive to say. But I think the puppies speak to innocence. They speak to his childhood. When
Mm,
he sees the puppies, he's at a place that he used to go to as a child with his dad. Um, I think it also puts on display the violence of people at this time and how that's
yeah.
perpetrated against the puppies. And I don't know if maybe the author, if the author is vegetarian or vegan, they might also be trying to get the reader to make a connection between how the
Mm,
puppies are being treated and how the humans are being treated. And
yeah. And
I mean,
livestock
I
and
think
modern livestock too now. Yeah.
yeah, modern livestock. And I think, certainly people, even if you are a meat eater, you recognize that there's a difference with how you treat like domesticated house pets and how you would treat cattle. But maybe the author wants you to kind of think about that.
Yeah. And we definitely do think about that throughout the story.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I just saw it as another way where he was kind of remembering his humanity through the puppies. And I thought it was interesting because it's in the zoo, which again, he's associating with his father. And I thought it was kind of interesting that, they're like little puppies and like he's playing with them and he's kind of having this like pure human moment with them. And then he couldn't like stomach what was about to happen when the teenagers were bullying them. And I thought that was just kind of interesting because I don't know if it means he still has a tiny shred of humanity in him or not because he couldn't watch like the torture. But I'm just like, but y- you're torturing people for business. You know what I mean? So
Right.
I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's a glimmer that, there is still a little bit of hope for him or not. Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, I forgot to mention this, but I think it's really I might have said this because now I'm going in circles in my brain about this book, but that's just kind of how this book works. I thought it was really interesting that it's outlawed that you can't eat somebody with a name, so you can't eat like a person, but and he gives Jasmine a name, which is
Yeah.
really interesting, and I'm
Yeah.
just like, "Wait a minute, like, hold on," like, because I think I know that was meant to, like, mislead us and think that he was, like, humanizing her, but I'm a little like, "Wait a minute, what is the author trying to say exactly? Like, what's the why?" You know what I mean? What did you think of that, Gary?
Well, definitely it misled us for sure. But he's breaking all the rules.
Yeah,
He's sleeping with a head. He
got her
has a
pregnant. Big
baby, has a
no-no.
baby with her, is gonna raise this baby. Um and so yeah, he's breaking all the rules anyway, so why not that one?
But I'm also like, how are you gonna raise the baby? Like, don't you need like a record of like a human birth? You know what I mean? I'm also a little like, how's that gonna work? How are you gonna register this kid? But
Yeah.
yeah, I didn't know about that. Um, yeah, I see it that he's actually even overstepped the morals of his time a little bit because that right now is the new taboo. Like even people who sacrifice themselves, you're not supposed to like eat people with a name that haven't consented, right?
Yeah.
And so symbolically, he's giving her a name and he's still treating her like cattle. He's still like doing that. So in my mind, I think there really is no line for him anymore. I think he's lost his father, he's lost his humanity, he's lost his kid. Yes, he has a new kid, but I think that it's kind of signifies that even things that are a taboo in that society are acceptable to him. And I think it sets us up to think about how terrifying past this book is going to be. Like, what's next? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Carrie, any last thoughts of Tender is the Flesh?
Uh It was pretty juicy, guys. It was pretty juicy.
Juicy. Sorry. I see what you did there, Carrie.
Mm. Yeah, yeah.
Um, what would you rate this book?
Ugh, you know I hate giving ratings. I would say a 4 out of 5.
I'm gonna go full 5 out of 5 stars, which is very rare.
Whoa!
This is my first 5 out
Whoa!
of 5. Honestly, be in the
Nice.
running for my favorite book of the year, if not my favorite book of my Lady Jane Books career. So,
Oh,
yeah, so I think this book,
wow.
it's horrifying. First of all,
Yeah,
from start to finish, it is a carnival of carnage, quite literally. And it
yeah,
is horrifying, it's terrifying, but it makes you think. And I think those are the scariest types of books that make you think.
yeah,
So,
for
so
sure.
Anne says, wonderful discussion, ladies. This book sounds horrible, and I'll absolutely never read it, but I loved your discussion. Yeah, yeah, it definitely changes you, Anne. So I think if you that's not your vibe, then definitely don't. But it is a good book, but it's definitely not for everybody. But Carrie, if people want more of your content, where can they find you?
You can find me at Very Literary Carrie on YouTube. I have been not active at all in the last I don't know, almost a year, I think. But maybe I'll get back after it. Maybe I'll start posting some more content now that I'm back reading with Lady Jane. You know, who knows? I might pop back in there. So
Well, thank you so much for reading with me. I always have a great time reading with you. We're going to have to read some more very controversial books. There's no one else that I can do this with, Carrie. Like, you're it. So,
you're it
thank
for
you.
me too, Jane.
Thank you so much, Carrie. I really appreciate you reading this with me.
Thank you.
And and that's all we have for tonight. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. And suddenly, cannibalism.
Oh gosh.